Hello, and welcome to our program. I'm Will Haynes of the Watkins Museum of History. This event is part of the 29th Annual Civil War and the Border series. Today, I have the honor of speaking with Dr. Thomas J. Brown. Tom is co-author with Carol E. Harrison of a great new book that I've been reading. It's titled Zouave Theaters, Transnational Military Fashion and Performance. This is probably the most unique Civil War themed or certainly including the Civil War book that I've read in a long time. I was excited to hear about this book because Zouaves are one of my favorite historical topics. Tom, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Will. Thanks for having me part of your conference.
Absolutely. Tom, I have a question to start off with, actually a two-parter. So what exactly is a Zouave, and is it a lifestyle as well as a fashion choice?
Sure. Good questions, and they get complicated. So the Zouave identity begins with the creation of the Zouave uniform in colonial North Africa, French colonial move into North Africa, and we could talk about the circumstances behind that. But they develop a particular look as a recruitment strategy, and like many sets of clothing, it had a set of ideas behind it, and those ideas changed over time. They changed within the French army, and then they changed as the look invented by the French army expanded really around the world. The United States in the Civil War was the single largest importer of the Zouave look, but there were also important examples of it in the British West Indies Regiment, the most important colonial troops in the British Imperial Army, the Papal Zouaves who defended the Pope's sovereignty over Rome, in a variety of settings that included Polish soldiers rising up against Russia, and the soldiers volunteering in the Brazilian War against Paraguay in the 1860s. So it was a fad in the 1860s. It was a moment, and it had sort of local specific examples, but there were some broad underlying commonalities, right? It was like many clothes, it was supposed to be a statement. And that statement was, as I said, varied, but at the very least, it was about individualism and separating out the individual from the mass institution that is an army.
Excellent. So that was a very good summary of what Zouaves actually are, which I think some of our viewers probably had that question. So that naturally leads me into the question of how did you become interested in Zouaves and decide to write about them?
Well, this was my wife's idea, and it was a great idea, and I was lucky that to be on hand to participate in it. She is a historian of France and French Catholicism, and she, through her interest in French Catholicism, got interested in Catholicism more broadly, and started working on the Papal Zouaves, this said multinational army that defended the sovereignty of the Pope in Rome as the alien nation came together and chipped away at papal sovereignty, chipped away at the kind of competing political entities within Italy, unified modern Italy, the last of which was Rome. And so this papal army, organizing around 1860, wears Zouave uniforms, which Carol noticed that is pretty ironic because the Zouave uniform is designed to resemble or is kind of a French fantasy of the look of a North African Muslim tribesman. So it's a little odd that the Pope's army dressed like Muslim tribesmen, and people talked about that at the time. But they agreed that, of course, that's what you should look like because these are the greatest military uniforms in the world. And so she got into the Papal Zouaves, did some research on them, and then thought, well, gee, there's more to this. It comes to the Papal army from France, as it comes to the United States from France. And so we started kicking it around and worked on it together over a period of time, had a lot of good dinner table conversations about it, and it finally came together.
Excellent. At this point, how about I start showing some slides from your research? So this is the very eye-catching cover of the book. And then we can...
The cover of the book, by the way, is kind of useful for introducing some major themes in the book. The cover is taken from this sheet of paper that was put out by a French print agency that mass-produced these sheets of images. It was called Épinal, was this town that specialized in this. And this particular sheet is basically a predecessor of toy soldiers, tin soldiers, right? These were paper soldiers. You cut out the figures, you paste them to a piece of cardboard, and you play with them and have your little battles and whatnot. And so it for one thing, it gets at the visual color of the Zouave. It gets at the gender themes that are going to come up in the book. You'll notice the female Zouave in the lower right-hand corner. It shows that the Zouave uniform in its full glory was a uniform for the common man, right? This is often the officers wear really spiffy clothes and the enlisted men wear more boring clothes. Well, the Zouaves were the opposite. As you can see here, the officers wore the traditional uniform of the French army, tailored jackets, tailored trousers, and whatnot. The Zouaves had the more novel look. So it comes up with that theme. And it comes up with the way that the Zouave is, as I say, a bit of a initiative to assert individuality in an age of mass production of culture like these toys, these images which are designed to be toys, and the replication, the seriality of the soldiers captured something of that, that mass production impulse that was changing kind of the cultural dynamic of what is an army, always a collective organization, of course, but the collective organizations change over time with the societies they're the product of. And now we're talking about armies that are representatives of modern industrial societies that have industrial cultures. And so you've got something of an industrial production of individualism.
And then here are some images of French Zouaves. At this point, how about you tell us a little bit more about how the Zouaves got developed? And, they really have their origins in French colonialism. In the United States, Zouaves are most famous for their involvement in our American Civil War, but their origins are different. So describe that and how Zouaves became fixtures in military.
Sure. And Americans in the Civil War never really forgot that. They never forgot that it originated in the French army, although they thought of it as something where the United States had kind of naturalized it, developed it in an American way. But they knew that it was a French invention, which begins before either of these slides with the French invasion of North Africa in the 1830s, and is not uncommon in a colonial context, as France proceeded in this conquest and tried to stabilize the territories they had gained. They thought, well, gee, let's look towards colonial sources of troops, of military recruits. And their idea was, well, if we dress them up in something they like, then they'll be more likely to serve in this cause. And so they came up with this uniform that included, as I say, something of a fantasy of a North African tribal look that included these extremely wide trousers. They're not like trousers. They don't have legs. It's called a surwal. They're just holes there at the bottom of kind of a bag. With an extremely wide waist. The French design for the initial uniform, the waist measurement was like 2 meters, right? It was huge. It's gathered in underneath this sash. And then it has a collarless jacket that is, it's open at the neck, and on top a fez with a turban. And so the idea of the original idea of the uniform is it's going to appeal to the natives. The natives will join our colonial adventure. Well, that didn't work at all. The natives had a way of dropping out of the French army, often took their guns with them. They were not, as often happens with these attempts to outsource, colonial conquest to the conquered. It didn't work. And so what happens is it becomes the look of French soldiers who were brought to North Africa from France, from Paris especially. It becomes a kind of motivational instrument. Will create esprit de corps within these units by having these distinctive uniforms. We will invite these natives of Paris to go native in North Africa, to appropriate the identities, what they perceive to be kind of the characteristics, the moral code, which means like the savagery, as they saw it, of North Africans. And so it becomes a uniform of French soldiers, somewhat masquerading, as it were, as North Africans, right? And that is the site of Zouave activity from their founding in the very beginning of the 1830s until the Crimean War of the mid-1850s. They're pretty much restricted to North Africa. They get to be pretty well known in the French world. People in the conquest of North Africa is an important event in France, and it's somewhat important in French culture. But they really take a huge step forward during the Crimean War, a major war which pits France and Britain fighting together for the first time in centuries, in the 35 years after the end, or 40 years after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, first time in centuries, France and Britain are going to fight together against Russian incursions into the Ottoman Empire. And that produced tremendous publicity. The Crimean War, in many ways, the first real media war. Right, there's telegraphs, there's modern newspapers as we recognize them. There are war correspondents. There is a great deal of war art of various kinds. There are illustrated weekly magazines in London and Paris that are running stories all the time about the war. There are, as you can see on the left, lots of paintings. There's kind of a grand style painting about the most important Zouave triumph of the Crimean War, the taking of the Russians' Malakoff redoubt. You can see all the Zouave bodies on the ground there, the cost of this victory, which was the decisive victory of the war. On the right, you can see Roger Fenton, who was really the first wartime photographer, who was sent to the Crimea by a British publisher to take pictures, mostly of generals, but the pictures that are really memorable are not so much the portraits of generals, they're pictures of ordinary soldiers, a lot of whom were Zouaves. And Fenton took pictures of himself, dressed up as a Zouave, right? It becomes a personality he wanted to play.
That's fascinating.
And it's very much of a personality, right? Look in the picture, you can see he's got I'm sorry, if you want to go back to a second to Fenton, you can see he's got a tankard there with a beer. He's smoking the pipe. Zouaves were famous for their smoking. They're famous for their drinking. They're famous for their foraging. In this media war, they really begin to establish themselves as a cultural type. And you can see some features of the cultural type really in the next slide, I think. So here you can see a couple, these both have to do with the kind of the domestication of the Zouave in Paris after the Crimean War, where Napoleon III recognizes that, whoa, these guys are really popular. And so he creates a unit of his Imperial Guard, that is Zouave. So these Zouaves are walking around Paris. The Imperial Guard was quite a prominent civic fixture in Paris, and their camp is just outside Paris, the camp at Chalon. It was the kind of place you could jump on a train and make it a day trip coming out of Paris. do an excursion, walk around the camp, that kind of thing. And needless to say, the Zouaves were the favorite, sightseers' place to visit on those days. This is another early photographer, Gustave Legray, showing this story, guy telling stories. And that's a Zouave thing, that they tell tales of their adventures, their tall tales of their spectacular adventures. And so you hear these guys are sitting around listening to their comrade spin his tale, and you can imagine it's probably pretty wild. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is a generic print from a French graphic artist of the Second Empire that shows a Zouave of the Imperial Guard with his foraging outfit. As I say, they were famous for making sure they were well provided for. You can see the cat on top of his kit. Cats were something of a symbol of Zouaves, which is a bit unusual, right? People often associate dogs with military units. Cats are a lot less controllable, there's a more distinctive symbol. He's lighting his pipe with a grenade. Basically, you can see the officers behind him saying, "What are you doing?" He's got he's using the fuse of his grenade to light his pipe, which is intended to illustrate the Zouaves, cool under fire, and also their love for the good life that is kind of epitomized by smoking, right? It's sort of a, pleasure of the common soldier, smoking.
Yeah.
Today, there's a popular kind of, go ahead.
Oh,
rolling
no,
paper for. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, well, this slide would seem to transition us beautifully across the pond to the Western Hemisphere, where Elmer Ellsworth usually receives credit for starting the Zouave craze in America in, I think, 1859 or 1860. But is the story more complicated? And why do you think Americans, when they did, took so readily to this military style that probably strikes a lot of us today as kind of bizarre?
Well, the stage had been set for Ellsworth. So the stage had been set, and I use that in a specific way, right? That's why we called it Zouave Theaters. The French Zouaves become important performers. Part of their persona in the Crimea was that they put on battlefront productions, and those battlefront productions become legendary. They have an improvised stage. The guys are playing all the parts, the women's parts. There's a legendary moment when, in the middle of a production, there's a Russian attack, and the soldiers all grab their weapons and go out to defend against the attack. Some of them in dresses, and so there's this tie between Zouaves and the stage that makes it readily exportable to the United States. That makes it a sensation in Paris, and things that are a sensation in Paris tend to become sensations elsewhere. Paris was the fashion capital that it would remain. And you can see here some examples of Americans picking up on it. There's an advertisement here for Bryant's Minstrels, one of the most influential blackface minstrel groups in the United States, one of the most popular performers in the whole country. You can see there at the bottom, they're one of the pieces that is on this bill is their, at that point, recent song, Dixie's Land, which of course would have resonance through the Civil War. But if you look up, you see they're doing this one called The Exiled Zouaves, right? So they're doing a Zouave piece in September of 1859. Which is well before it's when Ellsworth, just around the time Ellsworth is telling his, getting his small militia group to start wearing Zouave uniforms. It's long before anybody's heard of Ellsworth particularly. So as I say, theater provides a way for popularizing the Zouave concept. So does fashion, including women's fashion. And on the right-hand side, Godey's Ladies Book was the, path-breaking, the, kind of precedent-setting idea of a women's magazine. It had a lot of patterns in it for women to make things at home. And here you can see illustration how to make a Zouave jacket. Because Zouave jackets were very popular fashion items for women. And again, this is March 1860. This is before Ellsworth is well known. Zouave jackets became just a fashion staple for women. Everybody would own a Zouave jacket. It was just something you had in your closet. And fezzes became popular items for men at the same time. So the Zouave it's a cultural sensation in the terms of kind of theatrical culture. It's a fashion sensation. And people knew that as they prepared to wear military uniforms in the Zouave style.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, here we go. Here's Ellsworth. Could you tell us a little bit more about him?
So Ellsworth is going to quite self-consciously meld the sort of the theatrical, the entertainment side of the Zouaves with the military side of the Zouaves. And the big problem, the thing he wants to achieve through the Zouaves is the militia is kind of a, sad institution in the United States. It was not, there were a couple places, especially big cities, New York, Boston, that were Massachusetts generally, and New York generally as a state, where the people took the militia pretty seriously, but not many. And so, including Illinois, the militia was just a pathetic institution on the eve of the Civil War. Ellsworth is invited to take over a failing militia company, as many militia companies were failing, because he had become a drill instructor. He was interested in militia service. He liked militia things. He would love to have gone to West Point, but he didn't have the ties to do it. And so, his route was the militia, but the militia seemed like a losing proposition. So when he gets a chance to have his own company and to make something out of it, he decides the way he's going to make something out of it is to make them Zouaves. And he does that basically in mid-1859. Surely he had kept up with the Crimea. But he combines it with the entertainment by making the trademark of this Unit B spectacularly choreographed drill. And so they are going to become, just outstanding drill unit is his vision. And so he starts working on that, basically, as I say, in, kind of spring, summer 1859. There's a national agricultural fair in Chicago that summer. National, whatever. Boosters claimed it was a national agricultural fair. There's a substantial agricultural fair in Chicago, his hometown, where this unit was. And part of it was a competition among militia units. What's the best drilled unit? There were only 2 units that entered, but Ellsworth's unit won. So they declared themselves the national champion, and they issued a challenge. Significantly, they issued this challenge in the most important sporting newspaper of the time. It was called the New York Clipper. It would later become Variety. Today it is Variety. It's still the trade publication of the entertainment industry. And as the Clipper was the entertainment, the publication of the trade industry, it covered, what in those days was entertainment, which included things like boxing and sports of various sorts, and militia activities, and also, of course, theater. Anyhow, Ellsworth puts out this challenge. We challenge anybody. Doesn't get any response, and so he decides to have a tour where he could, in theory at least, compete against different militia units as he travels around, as his group travels around. But in reality, it's just an exhibition tour. They're just, they prepare a spectacular show where they do a number of moves that are more about visual entertainment than about military, practicality. Some of them are quite practical. Some of them are more, dance-like. And so he brings this combination to performance on the road, and it is a spectacular success in the summer of 1860. Just spectacular. This was the Taylor Swift tour of 1860, right? He's getting 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people coming out to parks to see him perform. And because women couldn't go to things like that, he starts performing in theaters, in the Academy of Music in New York, which was the most important performance venue in the country, seated about 4,000. And there he can perform for an audience of men and women. And as I say, some of these things were quite practical. Some of them were humorous, even. So for an example, one of their skits that was quite popular was that they assemble themselves into a circle, the kind of series of concentric circles. The concentric circles contract and contract and contract until they're all sitting on each other's lap and put their hand on the guy in front of them. That was an example of something that was not terribly important on the battlefield, right? But on the other hand, some of the things were significant on the battlefield, right? The things he would do in parks, they were about, as I say, the keynote of Zouaves is individuality. And that included individual freedom of movement and responsibility on the battlefield, right? They could operate in very small groups, 2 or 3 or 4. 4 was kind of their classic number. Instead of being instead of being line to line, elbow to elbow in a line, think of those soldiers in whatever, Pickett's Charge, or, at Fredericksburg, elbow to elbow, we're going to go together. And the way you're going to keep going forward is, you're going to stay in contact with the guy next to you. Instead of that, it was, you find your way to the front the best way you can, right? That was what the imported idea was from France. But as I say, that much is kind of important from France. But the idea of sort of this choreographed precision drill, that's Ellsworth's specific contribution. That's all different.
Yeah. And this slide transitions us quite well into my next question, which was how did women participate in the Zouave craze?
Well, as I said, they're wearing Zouave jackets, and so these soldiers, the Ellsworth, they know that they are wearing clothes that are associated with women, and that in the United States, that's more true than France, because in the United States, you've got the example of bloomers, right? And bloomers were a very important, very controversial kind of clothing through the 1850s. And that, those Zouave trousers look a lot like bloomers. And so you've got soldiers dressed up in what is, as I say, looks like women's clothing. And you've got a tradition of women's performance wearing Zouave clothing. And so the Seven Sisters wasn't the first example of that, but it was the most dramatically successful. It was one of the proto musicals, right? The what we know as a Broadway musical, essentially invented in the late 1860s, and the Seven Sisters is an important step towards it. It's kind of a variety thing that had at its center a set of Zouave soldiers, women, and they perform these sort of dance drills. Right, there's 40 women out there in a squad, a squad, doing something that is kind of a combination of dance and drill, not terribly unlike the ways in which Ellsworth's men, and Ellsworth's tour, by the way, he had about 35 guys with him. So similar sized ensembles doing somewhat similar things, wearing similar clothes. And the Seven Sisters was a tremendous hit, ran for 250 performances on Broadway. Lincoln only spends a couple nights in New York, going from Springfield to Washington. You can bet one of them he went to see the Seven Sisters. It was on his schedule. We're going to go see the Seven Sisters. So he went to the Seven Sisters. He'd see it again during the war in Washington. But this first performance, just a sensation. And so it feeds into this cultural momentum that comes out of Ellsworth that is takes part partly in copycat units. There are a number of militia companies that are going to start wearing Zouave uniforms. There'd only been a handful when Ellsworth started. There'd been like 6. But there becomes to be a bunch of them after Ellsworth. And also the kind of cultural Zouave takeoffs continue.
Yeah. Well, as you said, the Zouaves were quite popular in the early years of the Civil War. Now, as somebody who's been a Civil War enthusiast most of his life, and most historians and Civil War buffs have this idea, which I assumed was true for a while, that the Zouave craze died out when it became obvious early in the Civil War that these colorful uniforms could be a liability on a modern battlefield. And that idea would seem to be common sense, but there's more to it. As your book indicates, the truth is more complicated yet again. So did Zouave dress really lose popularity during the Civil War?
No, it didn't. That's just, that is us looking back at what we think of as the common sense of our time. It's important to remember that the whole concept of camouflage doesn't come in until World War I. Right? At the time of the Civil War, it was much more important to motivate the soldiers to go forward than it was to, disguise their visibility to enemy shooters. There not that many people were sharpshooters. Some people were, to be sure. Not that many people were sharpshooters. Not that much aimed fire is going to be aimed at infantry that is any distance away, right? You're not going to start shooting at rank and file infantry until they're almost on top of you, basically. The aimed fire, especially kind of sharpshooter type fire, that's going to be reserved for artillery and officers. So, you're not running this huge risk by wearing bright red trousers. And in fact, it's important to remember, the whole French army wore bright red trousers, not just Zouaves, right? In World War I, when they finally, as I say, World War I is a different story, and camouflage comes in World War I. And when they give up those trousers, it's after considerable debate in France. One general famously said, red trousers, they are France, right? And the British army is still wearing red coats. Right? Khaki has not come in yet at the time of the Civil War. So, wearing red is not that dangerous. It was more important, as I say, to motivate the people and to recruit people. And you, as an authority on Civil War recruitment, will appreciate, wearing a spiffy uniform was a way to recruit people. There's competition to form these units in the U.S. volunteers. There's only so many people who are interested in signing up. And if you are somebody who is aiming to be a captain of a company or a colonel of a regiment, then one way you might differentiate yourself, perhaps show yourself to be up to date with international military developments, and show yourself to be somebody who's interested in a unit that is about, the common man and, autonomy of the individual soldier. One way to make that signal was to make it a Zouave unit. So they're very popular. They remain popular through the war. In the Confederate side, the ability to produce the uniforms almost entirely disappears within the first year. So on the Confederate side, it is fair to say that it's not so much that they became impractical, but Confederate production was not up to it. But on the Union side, U.S. Army depots are making Zouave uniforms, right? If you want to serve and that's what you want to wear, well, okay, go ahead, go for it. They were willing to, accommodate you. So there are Zouave units that form through the war. There are, units at the very end. There's a Zouave unit at Appomattox, for example, wearing Zouave clothes. And it's important to mention, by the way, that, on the Union side, too, you've got production issues, and especially when groups are far out in the field. So, for example, the 35th New Jersey, they wind up with Sherman. They're on Sherman's, Atlanta campaign, March. It becomes difficult to, get a hold of the uniform. They stopped wearing the uniform because they couldn't get one. But they wore one in the march at Washington, in the grand parade at the end. Because they still thought of themselves as Zouaves. They're temporarily deprived of the uniform. And there are other examples of organizations that thought of themselves as Zouave, but for one reason or another didn't wear the uniform. There's one regiment, the 19th Illinois, that had 12 officers who had been in Ellsworth's U.S. Zouave cadets, including the colonel. So they were very steeped in Zouave stuff. They, the whole idea of a Zouave, they loved it. They were a famous drill team, but they didn't wear the uniform. But they had a newspaper they called the Zouave Gazette. They thought of themselves as Zouaves. So, in some ways, the uniform is, of course, the cornerstone of Zouave identity, but other ways, especially precision drill, of demonstrating your Zouavity.
Yeah, it's like an attitude. If anything, it's an attitude even more than it is a fashion.
That's right. It was, there's a bit of a stick it to the man kind of element to this, right? I'm not wearing the uniform. I'm not wearing the basic uniform. I'm wearing something, I'm styling here. This is Jacksonian America, right? Considerable emphasis on, resistance to hierarchy, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So, you have some images of some civilian, more civilian Zouave attire here. Now, the Civil War wasn't the American Civil War, I should say, was not the last act in the Zouave theater. So, tell us what happened on the home front with Zouaves in America, and then how long did they last after the Civil War?
Well, this ad for the Carter Zouave troupe, you can see these are young girls. They're basically, kind of teenage girls who are, in the tradition of the Seven Sisters, performing precision drill as part of a variety act. They did all kinds of stuff. They walked on, wires and they sang and they danced and they did Zouave drill. And you can see from the picture of the Teddy Roosevelt that, it was popular in toys, it was popular in short stories, novels, whatever. So it suffuses popular culture through the war. Not only does it not lose popularity in the army, it doesn't lose popularity within the popular culture. As to what happens to it, it's not like it proves itself to be impractical. As I say, people thought it was very practical. What they thought was really practical about it was that you could move any way you wanted, right? It was, the whole idea of a traditional army uniform was to encase the body, discipline the body, right? A stock to hold your neck up, look forward, keep your back straight, and you're encased. The Zouave uniform, on the other hand, let you, move freely and flexibly. And so for that reason, people thought it was tremendously practical, as well as the storage capacity in those trousers. So it's not as if it proves itself to be impractical or people get tired of it or anything like that. What happens in the United States is the institutional base of the Civil War was very grassroots, right? It was, in Ellsworth's case, it's the militia. And in the Civil War, it is the U.S. volunteers. It is these local units out there competing for recruits. It's not in an somewhat like the pattern of the militia. After the war, of course, the U.S. volunteers disappears, and you've still got the militia. In the post-war militia, there's a considerable reform movement. It styles itself as a reform movement. There's a considerable movement to make the militia better coordinated with the regular army. And as I say, the Zouaves were something of the antithesis of the regular army. So part of making the militia more like the regular army means kicking the Zouaves out of the state militias. And that is exactly what happens between the end of the Civil War and about in the mid-1870s. Places like New York, where the Zouaves are tremendously popular, right? There's lots of Zouave regiments in New York in the Civil War. And New York is a state that did take the militia quite seriously. Part of taking the militia seriously after the war is going to mean no Zouaves. So in the United States, what happens is they lose that institutional base in the militia. They've got no institutional base in the regular army, of course. And so after the 1870s, they're basically just part of the entertainment industry. And they remain part of the entertainment industry for almost a half a century, 40 years at least, into the 1920-ish period. And, they're vaudeville characters on the model of the Carter Zouave troupe you see here. Vaudeville characters. There was a routine started during the Civil War that was called the Lightning Zouave Drill. And the Lightning Zouave Drill would last about 10 or 12 minutes. And it would consist of somebody, a woman as often as a man, somebody performing the manual of arms to music and doing it at a very high speed, lightning speed. And or it could be a man and a woman doing it together as kind of sort of a dance sort of thing. And the lightning Zouave drill is just a staple of American variety acts from the time it's introduced during the war until the 1890s, right? And there are things that continue like that, various acrobatic performances, climbing up, climbing over walls, forming human pyramids that are part of circuses and stage routines for a long time. But it's not part of the military anymore. There's a somewhat quasi-military world of competitive performance drill in which Zouaves, as part of this, saying serious militia means non-Zouave, in those competitive performance drills, which flourished in the 1880s. They flourished right up to the Spanish-American War. The Zouaves are put in a separate category. So anyhow, that's how the Zouave basically dies out in the United States. In France, the story is very different because in France, the Zouave is part of the army. It's a central part of the regular army. And so in France, the Zouaves remain the prototypical French soldier of the Third Republic Empire. They're out there in Vietnam, in Africa, wherever the French Empire goes, it's Zouave soldiers who are doing that fighting. And that continues until World War I, when, as I say, France goes towards more of what we think of as modern military dress, khaki, camouflage, that kind of thing. The Zouaves continued to wear, there were still units, designated Zouave units. They continued to wear Zouave dress in parades and things like that, ceremonial performances, until the Algerian War. And then with the Algerian War, which, remember, that's where the Zouaves began, with the French loss of Algeria and the kind of national introspection that accompanies the French loss of Algeria, France decides, Zouaves, that's a book that's got to be closed. And that's when the Zouaves totally end.
Well, that's amazing. They had a far longer life than I think most people realize.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, we thought about calling the book The Zouave Moment, but we decided, it was really much more than a moment.
It really was. And I have to say, I would love to see somebody bring back that lightning Zouave drill. That sounds really interesting.
It would be cool. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, maybe for America's Got Talent or a show like that.
There we go.
Yeah, and speaking of performances and art, we've got some artwork to show us here. Could you tell us a little bit about some of these paintings?
Sure. Artists generally love the Zouaves, right? They're very colorful and picturesque. Winslow Homer is a serious artist who's gone for something more than decorative. And in this one, he's picking up on something that was very much associated with the Zouaves, which is camaraderie. Zouaves were, kind of famously good friends. And there's this kind of bonding culture of the army. The Zouaves were famous for it. So again, you see smoking as a kind of recreational activity of the common soldier that here Homer applies to the American soldier of the Civil War. The guy is carving a briarwood pipe. So a briarwood pipe, the briarwood pipes are relatively new at this time. They're better than clay pipes for smoking. Not a pipe guy myself, but I guess the tobacco tastes better with the briarwood pipe. Not as expensive as a meerschaum pipe. And they became tremendously popular. And you can see at the lower left-hand corner of the painting, the root the guy is carving it out of. And his buddies there watching him, and he's smoking away at his, and presumably they're talking. And it is a picture of some values of the Union Army. And these guys are wearing the uniform of the 5th New York, a particularly important Zouave unit for a lot of reasons. And the one of the values of the Union Army you're seeing here is the dignity, right? He's a craftsman. He's carving this pipe. He is not engaging in a pipe dream. right? He is doing something that takes practical skill. And they are, they are, as I say, they are a team. So those are things that made Homer think this vignette would be a good painting.
Yeah, I've seen this painting before, and it always struck me as, like it seems like a very placid, normal scene, and these guys are wearing these really elaborate, exotic uniforms. It just seemed so out of place when I saw it before, but it makes sense, like you said, when you place it in the context of this camaraderie that the Zouaves were famous for and that sort of thing.
Yes, you're right about the colors. How they, Homer highlights the colors by picking such a monochromatic background, right? The long landscape there with the browns, and then the tents in white, and the Zouaves really jump out of the picture.
Absolutely. And you've got another one here.
This was the biggest picture Homer had made to this point in his life. Remember, Homer is somebody who got his start as an illustrator for Harper's Weekly, the American version of the kind of illustrated magazines I mentioned, starting in Paris and London, and that were so important to spreading the Zouave image in the Civil War, the French Zouave image in the United States just before the war, and then the American Zouave image during the war. So Homer got his start there. He is in touch with topical things. One thing he took away from working for Harper's was, staying current. And so this picks up on something that was a bit of a fad in the 1850s, which was a game called quoits. And quoits was actually quite an old game, came to America from Scotland in the 1700s. But it enjoyed something of a surge of popularity in New York in the 1850s. Think of it as kind of the Civil War equivalent of cornhole, right? Which is very popular with young people. Just kind of a social game that you could play in a group. And characteristically in New York, it would be played in taverns. And characteristically, there were, people play cornhole with beer in one hand and, tossing the beanbag with the other hand. That it would be played in a tavern. And characteristically in the taverns, that you'd be playing for money. There would be a prize, stake. There would be side wagers, right? This is male sporting culture of the kind I talked about when I mentioned the New York Clipper, which covered quoits activities. And so what he's showing here is kind of the urban recreational life of New York tavern culture being transferred to the Union Army. And one of the things that changes when it's transferred is that quoits are iron rings that you would try to, get on this spike. Of course, the specialized quoits rings are kind of hard to come by. So soldiers tended to use a more readily available substitute, horseshoes. And one of the critics who reviewed this said these guys are playing quoits, quote, army style. That is to say, with horseshoes, right? Pitching horseshoes was not a common thing yet, right? The quoits was bigger than pitching horseshoes. So at the time Homer introduces pitching horseshoes, one thing he's saying is, okay, this is part of the army setting and the improvisational army setting. And another thing he's saying is luck, right? It's a game of skill, but there's luck involved in everything in life. And horseshoes were already associated with luck. They weren't associated. There wasn't a game pitching horseshoes, but horseshoes and luck were long associated. And so Homer underscores here that army life is full of luck. And this is, I'm kind of tempted to speculate that this may be based on an actual incident. Again, these are soldiers of the 5th New York. And there was a moment in the war where soldiers in the 5th New York were pitching quoits, and an artillery piece exploded near the game. And all kinds of debris rained down on the game. And nobody was badly hurt or killed, but it kind of underscored that all kinds of things happen in the army, and it is extremely, very much a matter of luck, whether you survive or you don't. And so, again, as you say, it's kind of, as you said about the other one, it's peaceful. It's again, camaraderie. It seems like a moment of off hours recreation, but there's an underlying tension there, in this recognition that a war is about accepting the fact that your life is going to be a matter of random chance.
Yeah, and it strikes me that the soldier pitching the quoits, he's like very lean, and his clothes are sort of flying forward with his movement. It's sort of like a very athletic. Obviously, it's an athletic pose, but just because of his clothing and his leanness, it's quite striking in that way.
You're right. It comes across very stylized. It is a bit of a performance, and he's got spectators, obviously. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I believe you have one more here.
Just one more painting of many paintings that involve Zouaves. I think it's a particularly interesting one, because we tend to think of Zouaves as kind of quaint symbols of the Civil War, as a very bygone age, very different from ours. And this is a painting that emphasizes the modernity of the Zouave. Right. There was a Zouave unit on Hilton Head. Hilton Head, one of the islands off of Low Country, South Carolina, that the Union occupied very early in the war, and made a real base there, naval base there. And there was the 76th Pennsylvania was there for a long time, and so with a Zouave presence. And here, Xantha Smith, who did a lot of pictures in that area, a lot of maritime pictures, emphasizes the modernity of the Zouaves. He's got Zouaves standing on railroad tracks, the railroad, quintessential Civil War era symbol of modernity. And this is a signal station, right? And so, signaling and communications, again, that's also very much about modernity. So, as you say, easy for us to look at the Zouaves and say, quaint. But that's not what people would think when they saw the Zouaves in 1863. They look at them and say, mod. Right? This is current. This is mod. This is, the values of our contemporary society.
Yeah. Well, it was in many ways a different time, certainly.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I think was really fun about the book. It captures the foreignness, the difference, the alienness of the past, which in military history, it's easy to think about time periods as being a little fungible. And you think, well, what are the military lessons we could learn? What were the mistakes that were made at this battle? There's certainly room for that kind of perspective. But there are other ways in which the times are not, you can't swap them back and forth. The strategies of mobilizing society in the war, the things that people fought, the ways they fought, are not the same. Not just technologically, but the values embedded in what they wore. We like to say that a lot has been written about why soldiers fought in the Civil War, but this is a contribution to how they fought, right? And an awful lot of them fought as Zouaves.
Yeah, that's right.
It brought people in.
Yeah, it absolutely did. Well, Tom, thank you so much for taking us on this truly remarkable journey through, military fashion and warfare and art and theater. It's really been unique. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Will.
Absolutely. And everybody, this is a great book, Zouave Theaters, Transnational, Military Fashion and Performance. I encourage all of you to pick it up. So with that, it just remains to say thank you all for joining us tonight. So with that, I'll say bye for now.